At some point on your journey toward awakening, maybe after a dramatic spiritual breakthrough or the gentle unraveling of who you thought you were, you notice something shift. The foundation of your reality felt unstable, like the ground itself had moved. What used to feel safe and recognizable suddenly seemed strange and distant. You saw past the illusion, caught a glimpse of the inner mechanisms driving your behavior, heard the chaos of the world for what it was, and then everything went quiet. Initially, that stillness felt almost holy. It was invigorating, like escaping a burning house and breathing in crisp, fresh air for the first time. But gradually, and almost without warning, that sense of purpose began to fade, not with a bang, but with a gentle vanishing. It was as if your spirit slowly dimmed the lights on your reality, and never remembered to brighten them again. The striving, the pushing, the reaching, it all just stopped. You stopped playing roles, not out of sorrow or defeat, but because of a kind of sacred fatigue. It was a gentle, quiet emptiness that oddly brought peace, even though it carried an unsettling stillness. And then, almost imperceptibly, a soft voice arose inside, a tender, aching question. Why do I feel so hollow now that I finally understand? This is the hidden paradox no one ever really prepares you for. We're taught to expect that spiritual awakening will ignite our passion, that stripping away illusion will fill us with unstoppable purpose and blazing insight. But for many, especially those who feel deeply, who search tirelessly, who are attuned to the undercurrents of life, it can unfold differently. It clears you out completely. It scrubs away every inauthentic motive until even the concept of wanting feels foreign. And in that emptiness, we often mistake awakening for apathy. I remember a conversation I once had with a close friend, deeply intuitive, profoundly insightful, someone who had immersed themselves in the teachings of Eckhart Tolle, Krishnamurti, and Alan Watts. She had come out the other side of her dark night of the soul with a sharp, almost crystal-clear awareness. She told me she'd seen through the illusions of who she thought she was, of success, of chasing love outside herself. But just 2 months later, I found her motionless in bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, lost in a silence she hadn't anticipated. "I used to cry because I felt like I wasn't doing enough," she confessed. "Now, I honestly don't care if I do anything at all. I thought awakening would light a fire in me, but instead, it feels like someone snuffed the flame out." Carl Jung spoke to this exact crossroad. He called it sacred ground, the space that stretches between the breakdown of the ego and the emergence of the true self. It's a threshold place, quiet and unnerving, where all the old motivations, fueled by image, achievement, and the need to be seen, begin to dissolve. What remains is a kind of raw material, untouched and unshaped, waiting for something real to emerge. This isn't a failure. It's the process of individuation. It's that essential in-between phase, the chrysalis of the soul, where the caterpillar dissolves into something unrecognizable before it ever becomes a butterfly. It's a kind of psychological death, necessary, sacred, and often misunderstood, that clears the way for true rebirth. But we have to be careful not to misinterpret this emptiness as a step backward. Because within the silence, something deeper is calling, a subtle, steady rhythm of soul truth, patiently waiting to be felt. It's not the old drive to achieve or impress, but the quiet urge simply to exist, to act, not for applause, but because something inside aligns and says, yes. This isn't about falling into despair. It's about that quiet, uncertain space just after awakening, when the old sources of energy have burned out, and the new ones haven't quite arrived yet. Jung knew this place well. He saw it for what it was. The greatest privilege we have in this lifetime is to become who we were always meant to be. So when your drive fades and motivation slips away, it's not the final chapter. It's actually the sacred first step, an invitation to stop living behind masks and start showing up as your true self, soul first. Carl Jung, the father of analytical psychology, understood this eerie, quiet fog that rolls in after awakening, long before it became a buzzword in modern spiritual conversations. He didn't dress it up in mystical terms or sugarcoat it with blissful promises. Instead, he spoke with raw honesty about what happens when the unconscious begins to stir. He described the soul's inevitable descent into its own depths, a journey inward, where clarity is born not from light, but from facing the darkness with open eyes. Jung once wrote that enlightenment doesn't come from imagining beings of light, it comes from making the darkness conscious. And while that may sound poetic at first, there's a stark and sobering truth behind it. True awakening doesn't drape you in euphoria or bliss. It dismantles you. It tears down the framework of your constructed identity, peeling back the layers of who you thought you were. It begins a slow, sacred unraveling, a kind of inner death that feels as necessary as it is disorienting. What dies is the version of yourself you once believed in. The breakdown happens deep within, but its effects ripple through everything. The hunger for achievement, the chase for status, the need to be seen, they all begin to fade, quietly slipping away. The timelines you once lived by, the goals that used to drive you, even the identity structures that shaped your relationships, your career, your daily routines, all of it starts to dissolve, like mirages evaporating under the heat of something far more real. But this is where the psychological depth really matters. Your ego doesn't vanish. It doesn't die off completely. Instead, it loses its bearings. The script it's always followed, the one built on expectations, roles, and conditioned desires, has been burned to ash. And in its place? Nothing, yet. No clear direction, no new map, just space. Unfamiliar, unsettling, and wide open. What you're experiencing isn't laziness, and it's not apathy either. It's something far deeper, a spiritual limbo. You're no longer asleep, yet you're not fully awake to whatever comes next. You've left behind the old world, but haven't quite arrived in the new one. This is the mystery, what Jung referred to as the nigredo, the blackening stage of inner alchemy. It's the point where the ego has crumbled, but the true self hasn't yet stepped into its power. From the outside, it might look like burnout or lack of motivation. But in Jungian terms, it's a sacred pause. A liminal space where the soul turns inward, retreating to quietly rewrite its own story. And yet, our culture recoils from this stillness. Jung warned us, the modern world will do anything to sidestep this phase. It labels it as a problem, tries to medicate it, drown it out, or rush past it, because it struggles to accept any transformation that doesn't come wrapped in success, speed, or visible achievement. What you're going through isn't a setback, it's an initiation. It's not a malfunction of the mind, it's a sacred descent of the soul. While it may resemble depression in some ways, it runs much deeper. This is your soul saying no to a life that no longer reflects who you truly are. Jung saw this as the true beginning of individuation, the sacred unfolding of your authentic self. Yet most people never talk about this part, do they? The ache that lingers after the light has faded, the eerie quiet that follows the moment of revelation. But this silence, it's not a void. It's a womb. It's shaping you. And if you can learn to stay still inside that silence, to truly listen to what it's asking of you, you might come to realize that what feels like a loss of drive is actually something else entirely. It's the first gentle sign that your life is beginning to realign from the inside out. The world might tell you you're lost, but Jung would offer a different perspective. He'd say you're being reshaped by something far more authentic. And that's exactly what we're about to explore next. If you've found yourself drifting in the fog that follows awakening, staring into the quiet where your inner fire once blazed, let this be your reminder. You are not broken. What you're experiencing is a deep psychological shift, so profound, so fundamental, that our culture doesn't even have a name for it. It's not just a change in mindset. It's a complete rewiring of your inner reality. The dreams that used to fuel you, the goals that once sparked adrenaline, the rigid timelines and 5-year plans, the motivational quotes you used to live by, they all start to lose their grip. Not because you've given up, but because you're being called towards something more honest, more aligned, and far less performative. It's not that you've failed. It's that the very foundation that once gave rise to your motivation is now falling apart. Jung saw this unraveling coming long before the digital age gave it language or hashtags. So let's get to the heart of it. For most of your life, your drive came from the persona, the constructed identity you built to navigate the world. That mask, that version of you who craved approval, admiration, and validation, wasn't a mistake. It was a vital chapter in your evolution. As Jung put it, the persona is a system of behavior shaped by the expectations society places on us. It's how we learn to belong, to fit in, to function in the roles we're handed. But once you begin to awaken, you start to see the mask for what it truly is, a performance. And suddenly, the act loses its power. You can't keep chasing applause after realizing the stage itself was never real. And so, the goals you once clung to start to feel distant, almost alien. They were crafted by a version of you that no longer exists. What follows is a strange silence inside, like an actor stepping off the stage, no longer able to recite the lines. Not because they forgot, but because the script simply doesn't speak to their soul anymore. You don't feel aimless because you've lost your way. You feel aimless because the identity that once needed a destination has been stripped away, and with it, the need to keep performing. You didn't lose your drive. You simply outgrew the fuel that once kept it burning. What you're feeling now isn't emptiness. It's a sacred pause, a quiet, open space getting ready to be filled with something more authentic. Something no longer built on performance, but grounded in presence. Where the ego used to push, the soul now waits. And it's in that waiting that something sacred begins to stir. Jung believed that the purpose of life isn't to glorify the ego, but to bring it into harmony with something much greater. We're not here to blindly follow the ego's cravings. We're here to refine it, to shape it, and ultimately, to align it with the self, the deeper center of our being that connects us to something vast and timeless. Jung called this unfolding individuation, a lifelong journey from fragmentation toward inner wholeness. Not to become the version of yourself that wins applause, but to become the version that's real. Unlike the ego, the self isn't interested in validation or performance. It doesn't chase ambition, it moves in alignment. Its only impulse is to live in truth, to express what is genuine and whole. And so, after a spiritual awakening, your entire inner system begins a sacred recalibration. What once lit you up, goals, achievements, external success, now feels strangely empty, like chasing echoes that no longer carry meaning. Your system starts to reject anything that feels fake, forced, or misaligned. That includes careers rooted in insecurity, relationships built on roles instead of real connection, and even the vision board you once created, crafted not from purpose, but from your old self's fear of not being enough. This inner cleansing can feel like both freedom and confusion, liberating yet disorienting. You're letting go of what's false, but the question lingers, what now fills the space? Jung warned that many get stuck in this in-between. Some awaken and then fall into the trap of spiritual bypassing, mistaking detachment for transcendence. They drift above life, label everything as illusion, and convince themselves that none of it really matters. But detachment is not the same as disconnection. The self doesn't want you to vanish from the world. It wants to enter the world through you. It longs to be lived, not escaped. It doesn't ask for withdrawal, but for full embodiment. Yet before that embodiment can take root, there's a threshold to cross, one that Jung knew intimately, though most don't recognize it when they're standing in it. It's that in-between space after awakening, the gray zone. A void that doesn't arrive with joy or clarity, but with confusion and quiet unraveling. It isn't poetic. It won't go viral. It looks like sitting silently while the world rushes past you, unable to explain what's changing inside. And in that space, it's easy to feel lost. But Jung would tell you, you're not failing. You're just in between. You have stepped out of the ego, but the self has not yet become your foundation. This liminal space is not a mistake. It is initiation, a descent into the unknown that modern culture has no patience for. Stillness is misdiagnosed as laziness. Pause is confused for paralysis. So you begin to judge yourself, and that judgment becomes the wall that blocks the energy your soul is calling home. This phase is sacred. It is chrysalis, not collapse. And if you can stay here long enough, if you can resist the urge to rush or retreat, you will begin to feel it, the quiet pulse of something deeper rising. The self doesn't shout, but it never stops speaking. Its voice is steady, quiet, and always there, waiting for you to trust something that has no name yet. Jung had a word for this sacred shift in direction, enantiodromia, the turning of one extreme into its opposite. And few places reveal this more clearly than the aftermath of awakening. You swing from the ego's manic drive, I have to do everything, into the soul's stillness. Why do anything at all? The pendulum doesn't swing because you're broken. It swings because balance requires it. After years of living in performance, the psyche finally exhales. It collapses, not in failure, but in rest. And that fall isn't a disorder. It's a rite of passage. In the language of myth, this is the archetype of the hermit, the retreat from the world that comes before the return, the quiet before rebirth. This is the sacred cocoon, the phase where the caterpillar dissolves into formlessness. No longer who it was, and not yet what it's becoming. It's the goof phase, messy, unshaped, and deeply uncomfortable. By modern standards, it's unproductive, undefined, and hard to measure. But it's essential, because the psyche is going through alchemy. And transformation, as Jung taught, doesn't begin with light. It begins in the dark, not through bypassing, not through good vibes only, but through descent. This is where modern spirituality often loses its soul, by romanticizing awakening while sidestepping the crucifixion that comes with it. Jung emphasized this again and again. The shadow, the parts of ourselves we reject, suppress, or fear, isn't meant to be escaped. It's meant to be integrated. Shadow work isn't some elite, next-level practice. It's the very ground we stand on when becoming whole. And in this strange state of nothingness you now find yourself in, the unconscious begins to rise, not as an enemy, but as a guide. The pain, the grief, the buried anger, the unmet needs, they start to surface. Because now, finally, there's space for them to be seen. And so, the ego begins to panic. It craves movement, direction, something to label, anything to regain control. But the self, it doesn't shout. It gently, persistently whispers, let go. Something deeper is taking shape. This is where the real work begins, not in achieving, but in surrendering. Not in certainty, but in simply witnessing. Your psyche isn't broken, it's doing something miraculous. It's digesting years of noise, illusion, and all the false striving you mistook for purpose. It presses pause on your ambition, quiets your hunger for more, not to punish you, but to give you no choice but to sit with what you buried. And it's in that stillness, in that vast and aching void, that memory stirs, not the memory of what you did, but of who you are. And then, softly, quietly, something within begins to move. A new kind of motivation begins to rise, but it feels nothing like the old. It doesn't come from fear. It's not frantic, it's not performative, and it doesn't scream for attention. Instead, it hums, a quiet, soul-led impulse to act. Not because you have to, but because not moving would betray something true inside you. Jung called this the emergence of the self, not some distant ideal, but a living compass that rises from within. It doesn't chase after success. It calls you, gently, steadily, toward wholeness. You crossed the threshold. You've stood in the silence. You've felt stillness, not as failure, but as sacred space. You've wandered through the inner night, where no voice guided you and no light showed the path. And now, slowly, quietly, something ancient stirs, not as thunder or fire, but as a soft, steady hum within. The beginning of becoming whole. It's a gentle pulse, not one that urges you to go back to the life you had, but one that quietly invites you to create something entirely new. Not a return, a beginning. This is the first true whisper of the self, not heard in words, but felt as a pull, a presence, a quiet knowing that lives beneath the surface. Jung called this the symbolic life, a way of living no longer governed by ego or social rules, but guided by the deeper rhythms of the soul. When the ego has let go, and the unconscious is no longer ignored but welcomed, life transforms. It stops being a struggle for survival, and becomes a steady unfolding of meaning. And here's the paradox. It may not look dramatic on the outside. In fact, it might seem beautifully, deceptively ordinary. When the self begins to guide your life, the hustle fades. You don't push, you respond. You're no longer propelled by the fear of missing out, but moved by the quiet, steady truth of inner alignment. You stop chasing clarity like a trophy, and instead, start recognizing it when it gently appears, often wrapped in simplicity, not fireworks. Living from the self doesn't mean you'll always feel energized or sure of your path. Fatigue still visits. Doubt still whispers. Grief still moves through you. That's the texture of being human. But what fades is the ache of constantly betraying yourself. That dull, persistent exhaustion from performing a version of you that no longer fits. It starts to lift. And in its place, something subtle but profound begins to shift. You find yourself creating, even when no one's watching. You say no when yes would have pleased the crowd. You follow curiosity instead of checking off boxes. And slowly, you start choosing peace over performance. This isn't stagnation. It's a new kind of fuel. One that doesn't burn like adrenaline, but flows like alignment. Not driven by pressure, but grounded in presence. Jung called this living symbolically, not as an escape into fantasy, but as a return to the soul's natural language. You begin to trust what once felt subtle or strange, the nudges of intuition, the images in your dreams, the patterns and synchronicities. Life no longer feels like a monologue hurled into the void. It becomes a quiet, sacred conversation with the unseen. And what does that look like? Sometimes, it's as simple and as profound as asking different questions. You stop asking, "What should I do?" and start asking, "What's quietly calling me?" Not "What's the plan?" but "Where is life gently pointing me?" Not "How can I prove myself?" but "What feels deeply true?" You let go of the need to control life, and instead, begin to move with it. Ambition doesn't disappear. It evolves. It becomes devotion. Devotion to what's real, what's honest, what makes you feel fully alive. And the surprising part? That kind of devotion moves mountains. It creates. It builds. It gets things done, but not from exhaustion or self-abandonment. It flows from wholeness. It becomes sustainable. It becomes soul-powered. This is what motivates the self, not the need to impress, but the desire to express. And this new energy, it moves you. Often without effort, it pulls you to create, to teach, to heal, to serve. Not because you're supposed to, but because every part of you whispers yes. So if you've been wondering where your spark went after awakening, know this: it hasn't disappeared. The old fire simply burned itself out, so a deeper flame could rise. One that doesn't flicker in the winds of the world. One that's steady, rooted, real. Jung never promised this path would be easy, but he did promise it would be deep. And if you're still here, listening, feeling, resonating, then you're already walking that path. This isn't the end of your awakening. It's the beginning of your becoming. And if something in these words reached you, if even one sentence reflected what's alive inside you, I invite you to share it. Speak it. Let your voice be heard in the comments. Have you ever met a soul whose presence felt like home? Or are you still walking the sacred path, back to yourself? Either way, your story, even if it feels unfinished, might just be the lantern that lights someone else's way. The sign they didn't know they were searching for. And if someone in your life is quietly struggling, believing that love must come with pain, that connection requires self-abandonment, or that they are somehow unworthy of peace, please share this video with them. Help me reach the ones who need to remember. Real love will never ask you to shrink. True connection doesn't require the sacrifice of your soul. And the most important relationship you'll ever have is the one with your own inner truth. Before you go, I invite you to subscribe and tap the notification bell. Here, we don't just scratch the surface, we explore what lies beneath it. The hidden architecture of the psyche, the quiet messages of the unconscious, and how every relationship reveals something about our personal evolution. If there's a theme, a question, or a wound you'd like us to explore in a future video, share it in the comments. This space breathes because of you. Your voice isn't just welcome, it's essential. Thank you for being here. Not just for this video, but for showing up to your own inner work. For honoring the sacred labor of remembering who you truly are. And always remember this, when the right person enters your life, your soul will recognize them, not through fear or longing, but through peace. But until that moment arrives, let your most sacred relationship be the one you nurture within. That is your foundation. That is your true home. And from that wholeness, all things real are born. Until next time, I'll see you on the path.